Today, I want to talk about mix bus compression, but I don't want to talk about setting one up exactly, but more about how to hear compression. I've got a few videos on the channel that go deep into how to use compression and what all the different parameters do and how they alter the shape of the sound and the tonality. So go back into the archives and have a look at those if you want to go deeper on applying compression as such. But this video, I really just wanted to concentrate on hearing compression and hearing how the parameters affect the sound, and particularly with regard to the mix bus, because everything is funneled through your mix bus. So anything that you do with compression, with EQ, with distortion, all gets affected in a big way if you just go about it in a slightly heavy-handed way. So what I want this video to do is to train your ears to hear these subtleties. And that might mean going backwards and forwards and having a listen over to some of the examples that I'm going to give you today. But it's really important, and it's the only way that you're ever going to learn how to hear compression, and that's to put the practice in. Now, there are a few terms bandied about when people talk about mix bus compression and what it actually brings to the mix. And the most popular word is glue, which is one of those subjective words. You think you know what it means, but then when you really start to dig into it, you're not quite sure, especially if you're a beginner and you're trying to hear these things and understand these terms and relate them to your own mixers. So glue, to me, is where things start to feel a little bit more focused, like they're in the same zone, like the instruments are all tucked in together into the same bed, if you like, just like they belong together. And I think what's happening is that the transients are being controlled. So the dynamic, therefore, is being reduced slightly. And the effect of that just gives the mix an overall feel of more cohesion and just starts to sound like a record. The other thing as well that mix bus compression brings is, apart from the control associated with taming those transients, it's also tone. Most compressors, particularly the analog emulations, have a sound, and that's a good reason for wanting to apply a mix bus compressor, is you want to capture that sound across your whole recording. And that sound comes down to tone and perceived as depth and width. And that's one of the reasons I particularly like to try mix bus compression to see if it works for me. So those are the two main reasons for thinking about applying a compressor to your mix bus: transient control and tone. So the disadvantages of mix bus compression, if you overcompress, are loss of transients. You get too much in the way of dynamic control and your mix starts to sound a little flat and one-dimensional. So it's important to approach mix bus compression with a level of subtlety, fine touch, and that is reflected in what you actually hear. Hence why sometimes you might feel as though you can't hear what mix bus compression is doing. But it's better that way than pushing it too far and causing your mix to just sound boring. Alternatively, it's entirely possible to have your mix sounding really aggressive by using heavy mix bus compression, and that might suit the style of music you mix and be exactly what you are looking for. That's an important point to understand, is when applying mix bus compression for yourself, the amount that you apply needs to conform to the style of music that you mix. Today, with this mix, I'm looking for something that's reasonably transparent, and I'm looking for gentle enhancements and gentle control. And the benefit of that for you in this video is that it's likely going to result in some subtle results and subtle changes, But by concentrating on those, you'll be training your ear to hear those subtleties in your own mixes and know when it's okay to stop because you've done exactly what you intended to do with the compressor. I've got my own kind of golden rule that I like to adhere to when I'm using mix bus compression because of how impactful it can be on an entire mix, is that I like to use small ratios, so 1.5 or 2:1 as opposed to 4:1, which you may see for more aggressive styles of music. But for me, I find the 2:1 or 1.5:1 is the sweet spot. I just want gentle control. And then after I've applied that ratio, I'm really only looking for 1 or 2 dBs of compression. And I want to show you today that you can actually hear that. It doesn't sound like a lot, but with practice, you can actually hear that. Another question often asked is, when do you actually apply mix bus compression? And I've seen it done all different ways. And personally, I've used it often from the very start of the mix. The reason for applying that compressor was for tonal reasons initially. So I wanted to be able to make EQ decisions with that tone already applied across all the tracks. Later on in the mix, then I'd start to dial down the threshold to build in some control for the transients. Another approach is to go as far as you can into the mix without a mix bus compressor. So you're kind of building in all of that automatically by using various different transient controlling options and getting the mix sounding as close as possible before you even add the compressor, because that then means the compressor has less work to do and is even more transparent sounding. And that's an approach I've been doing more recently. The key to that for me, though, is to apply that compressor before I bring the vocals into the mix. But that's just my workflow. Some people bring the vocals in way sooner than I do. I've always historically preferred to mix from the drum mix from the start, so getting my drums sounding great and then building in each layer of instrumentation on top of that, which then means the vocals come in at the very end of my mix process. Once I've got the mix sounding great, the instrumental mix, then I'll think, is there a way this can be improved? Well, let's try mix bus compression. Now, you don't even have to use mix bus compression if you don't feel as though your mix needs it. Don't think that you have to because everybody does it, because everybody doesn't do it. It's really important to have a reason for applying a compressor. Don't just stick one on and start randomly twiddling knobs and hoping for the best. Have a reason. So the mix I've got here is a rock mix. It's from my latest Rock Mixing Masterclass. So the mix bus compressor I'm going to use on this mix is the Cytomic Glue. This compressor's been around for a long, long time, but it's only a recent addition to my plugin list. All you need to know about it is that it's a VCA compressor. It's based on the SSL bus compressor. It has 1 or 2 of its own unique features. But I think it's a really simple plugin to understand. It's got all the controls you'd expect to see on a compressor, and it doesn't go too overboard with options. Now, in the course, I actually had this on trial, and the reason I had it on my mix bus was I wanted to experiment with it, because in the past, SSL mix bus compressor plugins just haven't really worked for me. I felt as though they collapsed the mix down, made the mix feel much more narrow, and I could never seem to quite get the balance right. I was never totally happy. And then I ended up moving over to using the Neve 33609 compressor for a long time, and that was fine. But after a while, you start to kind of get used to how these things sound, and in the end, I felt that was constricting my mixes as well. So for a long time now, I've actually not been using a mix bus compressor at all and been preferring that result. So in trialling this, I was intrigued and I was approaching it very much with fresh ears as to how this was going to affect my mix. So this is my mix, and this here is my mix bus. So it's just at the point where I'm thinking, I'm going to bring in the vocals now and start to mix the vocals into this mix. So, hence the reason for trying out a mix bus compressor. So up until this point, I haven't created this mix with a mix bus compressor in place. If I switch the compressor out, let's have a listen to this mix so you can get an idea of the instrumentation. Okay, that was just going through a verse, chorus, and then into the solo. That mix sounds great. I like the width. I certainly don't want to lose that. I like the depth, so it'd be great if we can enhance that a little bit. But also in terms of tone, it'd be great to see what this compressor can do to help me get a little bit more thump and control on those transients, particularly on the snare. I just want to tuck things in a little bit, tame things a little bit, just contain them in a reasonably transparent way. So first of all, compressors switched out. I'm going to play through that verse again and I'm going to switch the compressor in. So there's nothing dialed in here. We're at a 2-to-1 ratio. Threshold is completely down. Makeup gain is completely down. It's set to automatic on the release, which is a great approach to take on a mix bus compressor, an SSL style mix bus compressor. The only thing that's dialed in is an 80 Hertz filter on the side chain. It'll take everything at 80 Hertz and below and sort of bypass the compressor and send it straight out to the mix bus so that it's not acting on the compressor. Compressors react the most to low frequencies. So by taking them out of the compressor detector circuit, then they're not going to trigger the compressor. So that it's just going to be working on 80 Hertz and above. What can happen is when you leave those in is that those low frequencies will trigger the compressor and you can actually start to hear it depending on how much low frequency content you've got, and you can start to hear the compressor working and pulling down things like cymbal sustain and other sustaining instruments. So as a matter of course, I tend to just put an 80 Hertz sidechain filter in to stop that happening. But in more aggressive styles of music, it's very common to not use that sidechain filter and to actually go for that more aggressive, pumping, moving compression sound. So first of all, we'll play this verse and then I'll just switch the compressor in and let's see if we can hear anything initially. Okay, the first thing I hear was the low-end extension. The way that this compressor was handling the kick drum during that section, I really liked what it was adding, and that was that chest thumping punch, the low end to the kick. That's always something I listen for and love to hear in my mixes, so that's a win straight away. The other thing I heard was the sharper hits of the snare were being contained a little bit, not quite as snappy sounding, which I actually like and wanted to control more in this mix. So quickly again, let's do that. We'll play it again, and so I'll start with the compressor out and then I'll bring it in. So I hope you heard that then. First 2 points. I'm now joined by my other studio assistant. Those 2 points being thump on the kick, low end extension on the kick, and controlling those snare transients. So that's a great start. That's a win for me on two fronts. But we haven't even dialed in this compressor yet. So let's do that, shall we? As I said at the start, I like to work subtly with compression. So that 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction needs to be happening across the loudest part of the mix. So that, of course, well, in this case, and probably in most cases, is the chorus. So I'm going to play through the chorus and start to dial this compression in. And I've already set the ratio. I'm happy with the release on auto. I'm happy with the attack on 30 milliseconds. 30 milliseconds is the widest, slowest attack on this compressor. And what that's going to do is going to allow all the transients through. Something to note as well is that even though the threshold is at 0, it doesn't mean to say that no signal is going through the compressor. It is. And how much signal all depends on how loudly you tend to mix. I tend to mix on the louder side. So this compressor, even just by switching it in, is working. You might not see any movement on the needle, but it is working under the hood and affecting the sound. If I was mixing at a much lower level, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. And that's the reason why we were already hearing something happening when I just switched the compressor in and out on the mix. So on the chorus, I want to see 1 or 2 dBs of gain reduction. So let's dial that in. You can see the needle moving just slightly before I've even started lowering the threshold. So I started to hear even more low-end thump coming into the kick. So my next move is to start bypassing this plug-in or switching it in and out to decide whether I've applied enough compression or not, and if I like the sound of the compression. But before I do that, I want to level match. I want to make sure that the bypass signal is the same level as the compressed signal. So that's my quick process, just doing it by ear, setting the makeup gain to make up for the level we've lost through that 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction. You already get a taste by doing that, switching the compressor in and out. You're already getting a flavour of what the compressor's actually doing. So let's switch it out and do a smooth switch in as you're listening through to this chorus. Okay, I really like what that's doing. It's tucking the snare into the mix, so it's taking hold of those peaks and just bringing them down, and at the same token, it's bringing up the low end of the kick drum, the punch of the kick drum, I should say. It's bringing them closer together, and that's adding to that whole perception of glue, cohesiveness with the mix. Let's see what it sounds like on a verse, which is quieter. I'll start with the compressor out and then I'll bring it in. Sounds great. It's doing everything I wanted it to do. In the chorus, it's actually having an enhancing effect in the verses as well. More so, I heard it in the instrumentation there, coming more into focus along with the drums. So the guitars came up in body and feel. The keyboards, the synth came up in body and feel. So I really like that. So have a listen again. This time, don't listen to the drums. If you can, just listen to the guitars and the synths. I'll start with it out and I'll bring it in. Now that is really subtle. Sometimes it's not so much what you hear, but just sometimes it's a feeling. So it's really subjective, I know, but I'm trying to articulate what I'm hearing here to help you understand and perhaps hear the same thing yourself. Now, if we felt as though this mix was still sounding a little bit snappy and the transients needed a bit more control, yet we didn't really want to apply much more compression as such, gain reduction, then that's where we would go to the attack and start to speed it up so that it starts to clamp down quicker on those initial transients. And you're going to hear that on typically the snare and the kick. Let's try that, see if we can hear it. In a lot of videos or a lot of techniques, oftentimes people will really compress, over-compress the sound to help you hear that. And that's what I do in some of the earlier videos talking about compression. But in this case, I want to keep this level of compression the same throughout this video so that you can attune to it and not get confused with the level of compression going up and down. So I hope that makes sense. So let's hear this verse, listen to the transients of the kick and probably more so the snare as I start to speed up this attack. So I'm only dropping that down to 10 milliseconds. These mix bus compressors, the SSL style, on a mix bus, tend to usually end up in either 10 or 30 milliseconds. And what you heard then on the snare, it dulled off the transient. It sounded as though the snare was tucked in and a little bit further back in the mix. To be honest, I like that as well. So it just comes down to choices, what it is you've decided you want to get from your compressor. Let's go a bit faster then. I'll start with it open at 30, so that's all the transients have been allowed through, and then perhaps I'll bring it down to, say, 3 milliseconds. And for me, the snare's just pushed back even further there. It's not got nowhere near as much snap, and I wanted to try and keep that. This is a rock song, so that attack is pretty important because I'd done a lot of work up front to the attack of the snare. I've already done a lot of work there, so I don't need to do as much with regard to transient control on the compressor on the mix bus. So I'm going to put that back to 30 milliseconds. I'll play through whilst I do that and listen to the snare. Okay, hopefully you heard that. If not, rewind, have a listen till you do. Probably it might be quite good to listen to this on really good quality headphones, and you can really sort of hone in on that aspect of the sound, that initial peak of the sound. Let's turn our attention to release for a second and see if we can hear how that's affecting the shape of the sound. The release will affect how controlled the mix feels in terms of its overall level and its overall smoothness. And that can have a great effect on that tucking in effect. But it's really easy to go too far with the release and end up with it overly smooth and sounding flat and a bit boring and lifeless. It can also make the mix feel far away. I'm going to take it out of auto and I'm going to move it to the 100 millisecond setting. So this setting here we've got is a slow attack and a fast release. And 9 times out of 10, this works really well on rock mixers. And what I'll do as we play through is I'll gradually slow down the release and take it round to, say, 600 milliseconds or 800 milliseconds and see how that affects the overall mix. Again, really subtle, but you can just hear this rounding off, this tucking in. It's the only way I can think of to explain it. Rather than all the sort of spiky edges, it just gets a little bit more smoothed out and controlled and round. Let's do it again. I'll start from 800 and then I'll bring it back to 100. And I was hearing it on the snare more than anywhere else in that particular playback. So let's try it again. And it's affecting the width as well, or the separation. I could hear at 100 milliseconds, I could hear the instrumentation in its own space a little bit more than when it was round at 1.2. Everything felt a little bit more squished together, not in a bad way, in a controlled way. So let me play that again. I'll start at 1.2 and then I'll quickly bring it round to 100 milliseconds and listen to the placement of the guitars. I think that's where I heard it the most. And hear how the guitars kind of get blended in at 1.2, but then seem to jump into their own space at 100 milliseconds. So I hope you heard that. You could hear it on the acoustic and the electric. It just felt as though they had a little bit more life with the faster release. Now, again, this is all dependent on the tracks you're mixing, on the way they've been recorded, on the way they've been processed, on the run up to the mix bus. So there are no settings that will work for every recording. You've got to play around and see what works for you, again, based on what it is, your reason for putting the mix bus compressor on in the first place. So I'm going back to auto. So one last thing I want to do is actually take this sidechain filter out to see and try and explain how I'm hearing the tonality of the compression change when I do that. So we've been used to listening to the mix with that in place. I'm going to take that out. And let's listen to the mix and have a look at the meter and see what effect that has on the gain reduction taking place. So without the filter in, you've seen a tiny bit more movement on the needle, so the compressor was working harder and compressing more. But also then I was hearing that the kick didn't feel as present. It felt slightly recessed in the mix some more. That might be a different story if you were mixing with a compressor on right from the outset with the sidechain filter off, because you would compensate for that as you mix by adding more low end in earlier up in the chain. Consequently, that's also going to mean you're going to see more compression at the mix bus compressor, but there will come a point where you will feel as though you're getting that punch back. But then you've also got to be aware that the sustain of your instrumentation isn't being affected and you're not getting any sort of pumping. And that's where the release control, being on auto, can really be your best friend if that is something that you're worried might start to happen. So that's it. That's the aspect of hearing compression that I wanted to cover really in this video, because it's how I hear the compression on the mix bus. I always listen to the transient first. Once I've got the compression dialed into the right amount, I'll play around with the attack until I feel as though I like the way the transients are being controlled. Then I may have a go with the release and decide whether I want to try and bring a little bit more focus and clarity into the instrumentation, and also whether it has any great effect on the drum mix that I've already built up. Am I getting the glue? Am I getting that cohesion? Does it help the mix feel a lot more like a record with it than without it? And if the answer's yes, then that's a big win, and I'm going to keep it on my mix bus for the remainder of the mix when I start to bring the vocals in. So I hope that's helped you hear what compression does to a mix. We heard the low end extend on the kick drum. We heard the transients getting controlled ever so slightly on the snare as they were being tucked into the mix. And I also heard more depth, and I also heard the width that was being preserved that I'd built into the mix, and if anything, enhanced a little bit more. So with those 4 factors in mind, low end extension, snare transient control, depth and width, let's just quickly go through a chorus, and I'll switch the compressor in and out so you can try and hear those 4 aspects that I just mentioned. I'll start with the compressor out and then I'll bring it in. So I'm really happy with how that's sounding. I ended up buying this plugin because I really liked what it did to this particular mix. I think it's a really great example of how to hear compression. I apologise if you still feel as though this is all a bit too subtle, but that's exactly what I wanted to focus in on this video. I didn't want to wind in lots of compression and over compression. I don't want you to get used to that sound because that's over compression. I want you to learn the subtleties of compression so that you can use it in a considered way, in a transparent way. So I hope this video has done that. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up underneath. If you have any questions about what I've covered in the video, just drop them in the comments below. If you'd like to hear me mix this song right from start to finish, then you'll find a link in the description to my Simply Mixing Rock Masterclass course. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.